Good evening, class. My name is Michael. So I picked Jeremiah for the person for this project. The reason I chose him is because I've always been fascinated with Jeremiah chapter 29 verses 11 through 14. Everyone knows him. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and for calamity. And just getting to know Jeremiah just a little bit more in the book in general. The first verse where my character makes his appearance is Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were born in Ananoth in the land of Benjamin. So my presentation is going to involve a lot of Bible flipping back and forth. So I'm mainly going to use Jeremiah as the main, Hosea as a second, and just a little bit of more auxiliary verses just to tie into the theme. And the three key points I wanted to discuss was the new covenant that's mentioned, secondly, irresponsibility, and thirdly, being with hope. So in the first one, my first point was that the book of Jeremiah makes the reference to a new covenant, and that God will make with Israel and Judah, and that is contrasting to the old covenant made at Sinai, and the new covenants will be based on the forgiveness of sins. This reference is made in Jeremiah 31:31, which reads, "Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers for the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt." He goes on further to say, "My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord." This vision of husband and wife can also be found again in Hosea 2, supporting the idea that, again, God is the husband, God is this male providing both provisional and protective figure to the Israelites, the kingdoms of both Israel and Judah, despite them being divided at this time. He still loves them just the same and calls them both his wife in reference to wife. Again, this is reinforced in Hosea chapter 2, verses 16 through 18, where it reads, "And it will come about in that day, declares the Lord, that you will call me Ishi, Ishi, which is said to be my husband, and will no longer call me Bali, which is master." By the way, I am reading from the New American Standard. I'm sorry to have not mentioned that earlier. So there's this very beautiful, in a way, love story which Hosea actually describes, but that would be the covenant where sins will be forgiven in the extent of all this, despite the punishment that will happen that is being declared and proclaimed by Jeremiah. This is again reinforced in Luke 22, verse 20, where it says, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." This is the Last Supper now with the disciples. Verse 20 specifically, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So we know of a new covenant that is coming, and we know that the sacrifice that was made to fulfill the law was Jesus. And back then, obviously, they didn't know who that was, and so there is this new covenant that is coming that it will be made that is better or more improved, arguably is the word, than the old one made at Sinai. The next point, again, to irresponsibility, comes at the hands of Jeremiah condemning Israel's irresponsibility for maintaining their end of the covenant standards, and thus how God will deal with their disobedience. He further condemns the Davidic dynasty for their lack of agency, or kings and even priests in general, in leading the people back to God. This is found in Jeremiah 22:21. And so, if you're not familiar with Jeremiah, this is actually a lot of fun, and it has been a lot of fun for me, and just like going flip flopping back and forth. 22:21 reads, where the people respond to God, I spoke to you in your prosperity. God, this is God speaking. And the next line says, but you said, I will not listen. This has been your practice from your youth, that you have not obeyed my voice. Again, to name specific, so this is a generalization of the Israelites' demeanor or behavior of God, but this is further made microscopic and pinpoints the kings and sons of Israel and Judah, specifically in Jeremiah 32:30, where it says, indeed the sons of Israel and the sons of Judah have been doing only evil in my sight from their youth. For the sons of Israel have been provoking my anger by the work of their hands. Verse 32 says, which they have done to provoke me to anger, their kings, their leaders, their priests, their prophets, the men of Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In other words, everyone's involved, from leadership down to the people. So you can make the argument that, well, why would the people be held responsible? Well, because it's hard to say, but if you're not led correctly or not fed correctly, we make the argument that, well, I didn't know what to do. But that doesn't make sense, because the priests, the prophets, and the kings were held responsible for being heads of state in the family, in a way, or in the kingdom of Israel. So you have this top-down leadership that is failing to perform what they're supposed to do in explaining the law to the people, and no better way than to explain the law, aside from dictating it to them, is by living it out in example. So if you can't exemplify it, then it's not in your heart, and if it's not in your heart, then you abandon it entirely, and you make idolatry of anything that can sort of marry into it, or just forget about it entirely. Hosea chapter 4, verses 4 through 6 go on even further, and this can kind of be the caveat to the people in general, the regular Joes of the civilization, where they're saying in chapter 4, verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. I will also reject you from being my priest, since you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children. And despite the prosperity found in verse 7, the more they multiplied, the more they sinned against me, because that's more people who were coming into contact with these priests, who they themselves lacked knowledge and rejected the knowledge. And thus God rejects the priests, because they're not doing their duty. They're not upholding their end of the bargain. They're not upholding the end of the covenant. And God is punishing them, not only them, but they in general. Because when it would only make sense in a way, and my explanation is very limited, but the priests are Israelites, and the Israelites in general would know what the law is. And so it's like it's like the ignorance of the law is no excuse. Quite literally, in our present day, we know that we shouldn't be speeding, and ignorance of that fact means, well, it's not that we don't know about it, it's just that we have failed to look it up for ourselves. And we have failed to remember, if even not the law, but the history that God or Yahweh has performed in the past. The acts of the Red Sea, the sending of manna, what else? The Exodus from Egypt. These things that God has physically done in the past to pretty much demonstrate his awesome power to the Israelites. So these awesome things that have been recorded in their history, that has clearly demonstrated that Yahweh has worked on their behalf. Parting the Jordan, the bringing down of the walls of Jericho. I mean, even the story of David slaying Goliath. comes into contact here, comes into play here, where you're like, that history should, you know, just sort of be the key to remember that Yahweh is real, Yahweh has existed, and Yahweh has performed already, and Yahweh has kept up his end of the bargain always and always and always. So to kind of just tie this all together, without sounding too bleak, but again tying it back together to the covenant, the new covenant, which is Jesus, and tying it back to a message of hope, there is a message of hope. That despite the subject of destruction and punishment, in Jeremiah 1 chapter 10, this is sort of the decree that God has for Jeremiah when he ordains him. I wouldn't say the word ordain, but pretty much appoints him. It ends with to build and to plant. So, and the preceding verse is to destroy and to overthrow. So to build and to plant, it contains within itself the concept of a promise. The metaphor of plant and to root is also found in Jeremiah 42:10, saying, if you will instead stay in this land, when I will build you up and not tear you down, I will plant you and not uproot you. Jeremiah 24 verse 6 has that same fact of planting, or at least the planting imagery. So we hold on to this. 24:6 says, for I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them again to this land, post-exile. And I will build them up and not overthrow them. I will plant them and not pluck them out. On top of this, you have again in Hosea. I love Hosea. They're both kind of intertwined together during this time. And Hosea in itself is like a beautiful love story, which is amazing because it basically simplifies everything in Jeremiah and most of these prophet books. Chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. And it will come about in the day that I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil, but most importantly, and they will respond to Jezreel. And this is called, that is a name that means God sows. God is going to again rebuild his people. And this again plays in Hosea 14:4-9, where he talks about, I will be like the dew to Israel, where again God has returned. God is prophesying a future blessing that will come about to his people. And he will blossom like the lily, and he will take root like the cedars of Lebanon, and his beauty will be like the olive tree, and his fragrance like the cedars of Lebanon. Again, using the concept of blossom and vine. And in fact, the word vine is used, and they will blossom like the vine. And we hold on to our hope in Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, when we go to John chapter 15, and this is going to be the closing verse, I promise. I know it's been a lot, but it's pretty funny. It's just how the Old Testament bleeds into the New, and you can get references back and forth. It's actually been probably the coolest part of this whole presentation, really, where John and Jesus famously proclaims, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he prunes it, and they may bear more fruit. Verse 5 says, I am the vine. You are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Which is, again, the message of hope. That so long as we cling to Jesus and hold on to Jesus and realize that there is a future promise, which is mentioned in Hebrews 11, or 10, I believe. Actually, chapter 11, because that's like the Hall of Faith chapter. Searching for a new land, as it were. That if we hold on to Jesus, that there will be a future, not only for the Israelites, which is their promise at the end. They just had to suffer quite some time. And also for us, people who, Gentiles as well, because Jesus came to save both the Jew and the Gentile alike, as explained by Paul later on in his letters. so that we are not exempt from this new covenant, and it's not Israel specific, but it is individual specific, and even still Israel specific. So it's amazing. It's for the children of God, those who have proclaimed him to be their hope and have clung to him for their hope. So I just wanted to thank you again for this time, just to flip around pages in the Bible. It's fun. Again, I read from the New American Standard, and I hope you guys have a good night, and nice to meet you all.